Hi everyone, it's Natalie and welcome back to my channel. Just as a starting point, if the lighting in this video is pretty trash, it's because I had to change the time that I filmed the video today and the light isn't as good outside, so sorry about that as a heads up. Today I'm going to be doing my January wrap up. It's finally the end of this long ass month. Like, y'all can't lie to me, it felt eternal, okay? But it's finally time to wrap up everything that I read. So I think my general method for these kinds of videos will just be to mention them from the order that I read them and I finished them, because I just think that makes the most sense. So let's just get right on with it. The first book I read in January was The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This is an adult novel. It's an adult fantasy novel. It hasn't come out yet. It comes out in March. I read it early. It was my first book I finished in this year, but technically this book and the one that will go after it are books that I started in 2019, but I just finished them in 2020, but I'm gonna count them as 2020 reads because why the hell not? Anyway, this novel is basically about this man that works as a kind of caseworker for orphanages, and these orphanages are special because they have children that have magic abilities of some kind. So Linus, the main character, is sent to one of these orphanages because the higher management, as it's called, I think that's what they're called, in the book, but basically higher management wants to evaluate an orphanage in specific, and so Linus is sent there to see what's going on at this orphanage and see if it's being run properly. But it's queer, it's amazingly queer, and so I rated this 5 stars. I absolutely adored it with my whole heart and my whole spirit. The characters were really wholesome, it was funny, it was sweet, it had kind of like this middle grade vibe, but like for adults. Like it just felt very pure and happy, and like not everything that happened was happy, but just tonally I really liked TJ Klune's tone in this, because even though it's an adult novel, because the main characters are adults and all that stuff, it felt very comforting and warm, and that's what I really loved about it. But in general, I'll be talking more about it closer to its release. I just wanted y'all to know that I read this and I loved it, and y'all should totally be checking it out. The second book I finished in January was Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson. Sorcery of Thorns is basically a YA fantasy novel in this world where there's magical grimoires, and these magical grimoires have like personalities, but also if they're damaged enough, then they can become, what's the name that they have? I can't remember the name that they have, but they can become like monsters essentially and attack and hurt people. And so it's about this girl that works at a library that protects a lot of these magical grimoires. But essentially, when one of these grimoires becomes a monster, she's accused of provoking this grimoire into becoming a monster, and so it starts like this persecution after her and stuff like that. I feel like I could say more to explain it, but I don't know what else to say. But basically, I rated this 3.5 stars because I really enjoyed it, but I definitely saw its flaws. Like, I had a lot of fun listening to the audiobook because I picked this up as an audiobook. I have the physical copy because the cover is gorgeous, but I picked it up as an audiobook. And so I had a really good time reading this book, but it just wasn't amazing, you know? I just enjoyed my time with it, but I could see too many of its flaws. Like, the plot structurally had some pretty big issues. Like, it felt awkward at times, and the pacing was just a bit off and a bit all over the place. But in general, the main thing that I enjoyed about this book were the characters. I really liked Elizabeth and Nathaniel and Silas. Everyone seems to adore Silas, but honestly, I was a sucker for Nathaniel. Nathaniel won my heart, and he was the best, and I loved the little nicknames that he gave Elizabeth. It was just my everything. So yeah, that's mostly what I have to say about this book. It was a fun time. I recommend picking it up just for fun, but not really for anything deeper than that. It was just cute, and like there was a romance, but I thought it was pretty well developed, and it wasn't like at the forefront, it was at the background, and I felt like it developed well and it was believable, and I really enjoyed that. The third book I read was The Foxhole Quart by Nora Sakavic. The Foxhole Quart is basically about this guy who's really obsessed with this fictional game called Xe. And when he's finishing high school, he gets recruited by this college to join a professional college team. But there's a little issue. The main character, Neil, is like on the run, and he's supposed to be undercover, like hiding, because his family is a hot fucking mess and a piece of garbage. So he's really not supposed to like join this team because it's too much publicity, especially because the team, the Foxes, is renowned for being basically the messiest team. But because he's an idiot, Neil ends up deciding to join the Foxhole Quart, and it's basically the mess that ensues from all of that. But yeah, so that's kind of the gist of what the Foxhole Quart is about. There's far more things going on there, but that's the general thing you need to know about it. I think the other important thing to know is that this is a very triggering series. There is a lot of trigger warnings. This is the first book in a trilogy, and it just kind of builds into a snowball of worse and worse and worse things happening, you know? Another reason why this book isn't for everyone, it's because it's kind of like a soap opera, because things escalate and keep escalating, and some of the behaviors of the characters are not realistic. Like, there's critiques of like one of the characters who uses medication, and then people basically say that it's not accurate how he behaves on that medication and his behavior when he's off the medication. But for me, this series meant a lot to me. I first read it when I started college, and it just came to me at a very important time because Neil Jostin just means the world to me. He's very much like I am. He compartmentalizes a lot, he ignores his emotions, and he has very unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with his emotions and the trauma of what he had to go through growing up and what he's still going through. So it's just kind of special to me in that case, and also because it's one of the first books that helped me start thinking about my own sexuality, and where I saw a character that kind of had a similar sexuality to my own. It just meant a lot to me. So that's kind of why, like, in my heart, this whole series is 5 stars, but like realistically it's not as good quality, or people would say it's not as good quality. And okay, I'm gonna ruin a little bit my sequence of talking about the books in the order that I read them, because in January I read not only The Foxhole Quart but also the sequel, The Raven King. And like I already said, like, since I love The Foxhole Quart, The Raven King is also a book that I really, really love. It's just very, very intense. The main trigger warning for this book is that there's a graphic scene of sexual assault, so I just want y'all to know ahead of time that that would be coming up if you decide to pick up this series and you tolerate the first book but then you're not sure you can tolerate the second one. That's like one of the major things. The point is that The Foxhole Quart and The Raven King, I love both of the books, but I do have to say that reading The Raven King this time around was very, very heavy for me, and I almost couldn't get through it because of that sexual assault scene, because I just care about the character so much, and seeing that character go through that shit just fucked me up. And I was reading a bunch of really depressing books at the same time, and it just wasn't a fun time. But in general, I don't really recommend this book series to anyone. Like, if you think you can handle it, if it sounds like something that's interesting to you, then maybe give it a shot, but otherwise, like, steer clear of it. It's not a book that will be universally loved. It's just not. The fourth book I read in January was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This book is a collection of short stories. They're very weird and bizarre short stories. They're kind of like surrealist slash magical realism slash kind of sci-fi-ish. They're just a blend of a lot of different things. And to be quite honest, I picked this up as an audiobook and I wasn't really giving it the attention that it needed. And so I found it very difficult to follow in audiobook format, especially because at least I picked it up from the library, and at least in Libby, they don't really divide the stories into chapters, so it's hard to know when you've changed from one story to another. So that was just another layer of confusion. It's just not the easiest book to pick up as an audiobook, so I would just say, like, if you think you can follow it as an audiobook, give it a shot, but otherwise, honestly, I think it's best to just pick it up physically, because I think I would have understood it way better if I had actually read it with my own two eyeballs instead of just listening to it. So I rated this 3.5 stars because I did enjoy the stories, even if I couldn't quite tell when one started and one ended. But because I was confused listening to the audiobook and because I wasn't paying as much attention, I definitely saw how all the stories were meaningful, but I couldn't really figure it out. What was the meaning behind them? What was the depth? Like, I had some idea, but I felt like I wasn't smart enough to figure them out, I guess. So it was just a mixed bag with that one. The 5th book I finished was More Happy Than Not by Adam Silvera. More Happy Than Not is a YA novel about this boy named Aaron who wants to forget that he's gay, basically. And it's set in, Adam Silvera does a lot of like current but slightly modernish New York settings. So it's set in this New York where there's institutions where you can have part of your memories suppressed. And so you kind of forget the things, but it's not really forgetting. It's just kind of like in the back of your head and you can't access it unless you have another traumatic experience so closely aligned to the one that you were trying to forget that it kind of all resurfaces. So it's essentially about Aaron who wants to forget he's gay, and it's because there's a series, he goes through a series of traumas that he thinks are related to him being gay but are not entirely related to that, and you kind of follow him as tries to pursue getting this procedure. I rated this book 4 stars. It was really fucking sad and it surprised me because like the first like 140 pages are pretty mild and then suddenly Adam Silvera just went for my fucking throat and ruined my life. So it was amazing, but it's a lot. It's very, very intense and emotional, and the reason I gave it 4 stars instead of 5 is because this has the kind of ending where it's not as hopeful as I would have liked it to be. Like, the character goes through a bunch of shit, and I think this might be considered a spoiler, but I'm not going into the specifics. But essentially, he goes through a bunch of shit, and there's really no payoff to that. Like, no happy ending. I'm definitely a lover of happy endings. It's not that everything has to be rainbows and butterflies and perfect, but I prefer my endings to feel hopeful, and this wasn't quite that. And I just didn't fuck with that. Like, I wasn't in the mood for that. and so that kind of affected my enjoyment of it. But otherwise, I thought it was an amazing novel. Aaron is definitely like a problematic fave. He's not a perfect teenage boy. He makes mistakes and he says the wrong thing and he does the wrong thing. And he doesn't quite face consequences for those things. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I wasn't expecting it to hit me like it hit me, but I deep down appreciated it. The next book I finished was The Queens of Ennis Lear by Tessa Gratton. The Queens of Ennis Lear is a retelling of King Lear by Shakespeare. So just, it's a tragedy. A lot of people die. But it's essentially about these 3 sisters who are fighting for the crown. The king is getting old, kind of losing his mind, and he's supposed to name an heir, but he basically doesn't. And so it's about this struggle between these sisters to get the crown. In general, this is another book that I wouldn't recommend to just anyone. It has a very slow pacing and it's a thick one, you know? It's 500 pages long. It's over 500 pages long, and so it's really not going to be for everyone because it has a very flowery writing style and the pace goes pretty slowly and it's character based. So just like if you're looking for a book that has a really fast-paced plot and it's very engaging in that way, I don't recommend picking this up. But for me, this was a reread, and it's a 5-star book for me. I'm not gonna lie, this time around reading it, I didn't enjoy it as much, but it's because mainly I started it and I was pressuring myself to pick it up instead of just letting myself read it naturally. But because since it's such a slow-paced novel, it's really more of like just let yourself read it when you want to and read as much as you want to and just take your own pace with it. I feel like that's the proper approach to this book. It's not really a bingeable book, although I know that some people have binged it. But for me, that kind of deterred from my enjoyment rereading it because it just didn't hit me the same way. And it was mostly because I read it before bed, I was forcing myself to read, and honestly I was just jinxing myself. But either way, as you can see, this was my reread to annotate it, and I
annotated it a lot. So obviously I still loved it. I still found things to love, but it just wasn't as enjoyable as the first time I read it. But I think that's more my fault than the book's fault. The 7th book I read, right off the bat, is not going to be for everyone. It's, I feel like I've said this like 10 million times in this video, but I just have very niche tastes, okay? I can't help it. I mean, I also like popular things and whatever, and popular authors, but I also like some stuff that I'm very aware of the fact that it's not palatable for everyone. But basically, I read a smutty romance novel that is a priest novel. So if y'all are not into reading a gay romance where an artist falls in love with the priest of a megachurch, then just don't read this book. But anyway, the book is called Worship by Ella James. I picked this up completely on a whim because I just felt like reading some smut, and I was like, you know what? Why not try this out? Because I already had a feeling that priest romances would be my thing, and they're definitely my thing. I ended up rating this 4 stars because I just had a really good ass time reading it. It was fun. It was really a really quick read. And my only complaint about it, the only reason I didn't give it 5 stars just for pure enjoyment, was because I'm pretty sure this is a self-published novel, so it ended really abruptly to make you pick up the sequel, Adore, and that just kind of ruined the enjoyment for me. Like, I just would have preferred for it to just be 1 book, but instead it was broken up into 2, and that's kind of why I rated the first one, Worship, 4 stars. Speaking of the sequel, Adore, that one was a DNF for me, because it was just so poor compared to the first one. Like, the first one had a lot of tension between the priest and the artist, and there was always like build up to the sex scenes and stuff like that. But in the sequel, that just all kind of went away. Like, the pacing in general was really weird. We had a lot of summary, and just the characters would just randomly start having sex, and that just isn't really my thing. I like the buildup of tension to those scenes, and this one just didn't have that. Like, literally, the characters would be having a very emotional conversation, which is very hard for them to do because the priest is emotionally constipated. But like, he would start opening up, and then suddenly they're just fucking, and it's not even like there's a build up to that fucking. No, they're talking, and then just suddenly the priest kisses the guy, and then they fuck, and I'm like, really? And then it's not even descriptive, it just kind of summarizes it. He's like, I kissed him, and then blah blah blah, and then 3 more sentences, and that's it, and that was the sex. And I don't fuck with that, okay? I'm like, that's just boring, okay? It's just boring, and I was not here for it. So that's officially my first DNF of the year. I was like, I'm like, already smut is not the best written shit. I love it because I love it. I do enjoy reading it, but it's already something that I have to turn my brain off to read. But if I'm actually feeling pained thinking about having to pick up to read, like, that's not the point. I pick up smut for fun. So like, if I'm not feeling it, if I'm not happy, if I'm not looking forward to picking it up, then I just need to stop reading it and pick up the next one, you know? The 8th book I finished, I'm not really counting them as I'm supposed to because some of them go together as parts of a series and I haven't really counted them. Technically, this would be like the 10th book I finished. The 10th book, or 8th, whatever you want to call it, that I finished was The Hearing Trumpet by Leonora Carrington. This book is another niche one. I mainly picked this up because last semester one of my professors asked me to interview an author, and as a thank you for doing that for her, she gave me this book because she thought I would enjoy it. And so it's this really weird book about this old lady that is gifted this hearing trumpet because she can't hear that well. And once she gets this hearing trumpet, she starts, you know, being able to listen in to the conversations of other people. And her son puts her in this home for the elderly, but it's already like a weird elderly home because there's like the buildings that the people live in are like igloos and in the shape of a mushroom and stuff like that. So it's a very, very surrealist book. It's just wild. And so I don't really know how else to describe it. I didn't rate this one because it's an older publication, and so there were some things about it that were questionable, and I just didn't really know how I felt about it. But I thought that in theory it was a fun book and an interesting one at least to read, but I don't really know how much I actually genuinely enjoyed it, and I don't know if I would recommend it either. And finally, the last book I read this month was Space Struck by Paige Lewis. This is a poetry collection. I don't really know how to talk about poetry, especially in video format. I don't really know how to talk about poetry in general. I find it very hard to articulate what I feel and what I think. But I rated this 4 stars because I absolutely loved reading the poems. I thought they were pretty amazing, and the things the author did with formatting and just imagery and just word choice, it was just, see, I'm illiterate. I'm an English major, but I'm illiterate. I just don't really know how to talk about it in a more enjoyment kind of sense. I just know whether I liked it or not, and this collection just really worked for me. So yeah, I gave it 4 stars mainly because it didn't quite hit me in the heart. Like, I really enjoyed reading it, and I liked sitting down to read it, you know? I feel so repetitive, but I hope that made some semblance of sense, you know? So basically, for a roundup, since I was terrible as always with numbers while filming this video, I read a total of 10 books and I DNF'd 1 book. So that makes a total of 11 books read in January, which is actually quite a lot for me. I don't tend to read that much regularly. Usually I read about 6 books a month, and that's the most I can do unless it's summer. But anyway, I'm really happy with this month's reading. I think it bodes well for the rest of the year, but we'll see about that. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Thank you all so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you like this video. And if you want to follow me on any of my social media, I will link all of that down below so you can follow me there. But for now, see you next time.